Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the OCB 2025 Summer Workshop. So glad to see all of the fantastic participation we've seen thus far this week. We have a great lineup for today and tomorrow morning with this session on land-ocean connectivity. Faye Da is going to give a brief introduction to the session in a few minutes. I just wanted to start the day in case we have new participants, which I presume we have lots of different people joining every day, different people coming in with different interests. You can find everything you need on the Summer Workshop website. The draft schedule is there. You can register for the Zoom if you haven't done so, although if you're here, you obviously have done that. But we also encourage you to keep doing those satellite gatherings all over the world and send us pictures or tag us on Blue Sky and we'll share them because it's really fun to see. Yesterday we had the room full of Seattle participants joining us, and it was really great to see. So OCB is really a collaborative network of scientists working at the nexus of climate and marine life and biogeochemistry. On these green icons at the top of the slide kind of give you a sense of the breadth of the program and the high level science focus areas. You can find more detailed research questions that OCB is addressing on our website which is listed right there. You can also subscribe to our e-newsletter, which goes out monthly. There's an email address that goes to all of us in the project office, where we have me, Heather Benway, May Mahegan, who's also on the line, and Mary Zawoski, who's also on the line. You can find us on social media, including Blue Sky, and on YouTube, you can find recordings of pretty much every activity that we do. It is hybrid or virtual, and so it's a really nice resource in case you can't make one of our workshops or you miss a session this week. You'll be able to find it on YouTube. Just want to send a big shout out and thank you for the sustained support from NSF and NASA through the years. OCB has been going since 2006, and this community has grown. We've developed new science areas that have kind of broken off and become their own entity, and it's been an exciting thing to kind of seed these new science initiatives and communities and then watch them spin off and gain momentum and become these great things like the Biogeoscapes initiative you heard a little bit about yesterday. Also want to thank Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which hosts the OCB project office. With that, I am going to pass it off to Faye Da to introduce our land ocean session.
Right, thank you, Heather. Welcome, everyone. My name is Faye. I'm a postdoc at Princeton. Thank you so much for joining our session organized by David, Libby, Kanchan, Shaily. In this session, we will explore how watershed and climate factors shape biogeochemistry across rivers, estuaries, tidal wetlands, and coastal oceans. So what is the motivation for organizing this session? I think first, linking land to ocean is essential for understanding the full carbon cycle. The figure on the left here shows a traditional view of the ocean alkalinity budget, where river inputs is assumed to balance the barrier of calcium carbonate in coastal and deep ocean sediments. However, this view reveals a significant imbalance in the ocean's alkalinity budget, which we can see from this input versus the output here. Middleburg 2022 proposed several explanations for this discrepancy, one of which is the overlooked contribution of particulate inorganic carbon from rivers. So it is important to remember that ultimate source of alkalinity in the ocean is weathering on land. As a oceanographer, we often don't think much about weathering and erosion, but these terrestrial processes are fundamental for closing global carbon budgets and resolving the long-standing imbalances. Additionally, climate change, extreme events, and human activities are altering how carbon and nutrients are produced, transported, and processed across watersheds and coastal zones. It is very important to understanding these changes. Finally, there are many advances in like modeling Earth observations and in situ sensors that making it possible to quantify fluxes and processes across the land-ocean continuum. I will just use this very simple example of carbon cycle on the Earth's surface to explain how we structure our session. So for example, in the carbon cycle, plants on land, plants takes in CO2 and turn it into organic matter. When plants and animals die, microbes break them down and release CO2 back into the air. Some of this carbon, along with carbon from rock weathering, flows through rivers into the ocean and gets buried in sediments. Over millions of years, buried carbon is pushed into the Earth's interior and by tectonic forces, eventually returns to the surface through volcanoes or when sea level is lifted onto the land. So as we can see, the carbon cycle involves biogeochemical linkages across terrestrial and oceanic systems. That's why we've structured the session into 3 subsections spanning the next day and a half. We have this morning, we'll have this river system, and in the afternoon, we'll focus on the estuaries and wetlands. And tomorrow morning, please come back. We have our final section, coastal ecosystems. In this session, we will have a series of process-focused talks, including some case studies and covering both observational platforms and numeric modeling approaches. For the river systems, for example, talks will explore how weathering and erosion in the critical zone shape the generation of inorganic and organic carbon at the headwaters. And we'll also trace the transport and transformation of carbon and nutrients through inland water systems. And this afternoon for the estuaries and wetland section, the talks will examine carbon cycling and fluxes across the land-ocean interface, with a focus on estuarine and wetland transitions and the representations in models and budgets. They will also highlight the role of blue carbon ecosystem in modulating biogeochemical processes from local to continental scales. And for tomorrow morning, the coastal ecosystem section, the talks will explore how coastal ecosystems generate, transform, and export dissolved organic matter and alkalinity across coastal ocean. Also examine how environmental change such as saltwater intrusion, altered hydrology, extreme events, and anthropogenic carbon shapes biogeochemical responses. So with that, I'd like to switch over to Shaily, who will be moderating this morning's section on river systems.
Okay, great. Hi, welcome everyone. So as Faye let you know, we are going to spend first a part of our session in this area here. Can you see my mouse as well? Yes, no? Okay, we're going to be spending some time in the river section, and to as Faye indicated, let me just motivate this section. So this is don't pay attention too much to this model. So this is a global inverse model that is tied to organic carbon burial, most of which, you know, is going to occur in the ocean. And so the points in this coupled model that we're going to spend some time in is looking at weathering fluxes of carbon, both organics and carbonates, how they may be tied to silicate mineral weathering also, which is part of a climate feedback. We are going to be looking at the fate of organic carbon as it's transported from rivers into coastal systems. And all of these large motivating premises that, you know, all of these coupled factors control ocean pH and atmospheric CO2 over really long time scales. So the time scales here are billions of years. And so Suzanne is going to get us started with weathering and erosion. And then we're going to move on to Nicole Fernandez, who's going to give us some more insight on reactive transport modeling of the critical zone. Shuang Zhang is going to be talking to us about inorganic carbon transport through river networks, also related to weathering. And then we're going to switch over more to the fate of organic carbon and organic matter with Jennifer Bowen. Followed by a more case study type talk by Blake Clark, where he's going to take us to the Arctic. And then finally, Tom Bianchi is going to kind of tie us back to this land-ocean interface. We're talking about carbon processing in the critical zone across this aquatic continuum. And finally, we have 3 lightning talks related to the Arctic Ocean, groundwater, and how we can use remote sensing. So with that, I think we can start our first talk.
Can I add one thing, Shaily?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, we have many speakers in the session, and each talk is only like 15 to 20 minutes. So we won't have any time for questions after the talk. But if you have any questions, please type in the chat to the speaker, and or we'll come back to the panel discussion. We have panel discussion for each subsection, and we'll answer questions there as well. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to share Suzanne's recorded talk.
Apologize for not giving a live presentation. I'm in Washington, D.C. today for congressional science visits organized by AGU. This workshop, shifting to virtual format, was one of the straws that tipped me into signing up. I'm a full professor and I'm president of the Earth and Planetary Surface Processes section at AGU, and felt that I could serve my communities best by speaking up to try to protect federal funding for science and to protect the federal scientific workforce. But I'm sorry that our session fell on the same day as the visits to Congress that AGU planned. I should be able to join the Zoom tomorrow, but let's get on to weathering and erosion. This session was billed as exploring how watershed characteristics and climatic factors shape river biogeochemistry and influence downstream biogeochemical cycles. That got me to thinking about this question. What actually controls the biogeochemistry of a sample like the one shown here? This is Marissa Repash, now an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. She had just collected a sample from the Canning River on the north slope of Alaska for her study of carbon cycling in this system. Her postdoc was attached to our Icy Landscapes project on fluvial sediment dynamics and carbon in rivers. There are many candidates for control of the composition of the sample Marissa has collected. Are glaciated and have steep terrain. There are fluvial terraces. There's polygonal coral next to this channel. There are older last glacial maximum moraines from Pleistocene glaciers. On the active floodplain, there are ponds. There are snowbanks that are delivering water into the system. And there's a hyporeic zone, a shallow groundwater system in the river corridor itself. All of these parts of the watershed differ in their characteristics, and all of these affect the biogeochemistry of samples that we might collect. The challenge that we face in addressing these questions is, as stated here long ago by Sue Brantley, it's not a hydrologic problem, it's not a solid earth problem, it's not biological. It couples all of these processes together across temporal and spatial scales. The statement, watershed characteristics and climatic factors shape river biogeochemistry, is a little like motherhood and apple pie. It feels good, but it lacks specificity. Today, I'll really focus on 2 aspects of this. One is weathering processes, and the other is the role of sediments. You can think of the Earth's surface in headwaters as being really a flow-through reactor, in which rock is being brought up towards the surface by removal and erosion at the surface, and it progressively weathers as it moves through that system. The critical zone is thus structured and shaped in many ways. Todd Dawson and co-authors highlight here the interaction between plant roots, weathering, and water. And they especially note what Dietrich and Rempe called rock moisture that it's held within this system. The structure of the critical zone will affect the partitioning of water. Will it go out to the atmosphere, or will it travel down through the subsurface and eventually out to the stream? How long will it take to travel those flow paths? All these are controlled, as discussed by Ying Fan in this manuscript. So critical zone architecture is a product of the processes that we're talking about and also affects the processes we'll discuss. Let's dig into the geomorphology component of this slide here, thinking about what causes rock damage, which sets it on the process as it approaches the surface. So we'll talk first about mechanical weathering. And I really want to highlight just one aspect of mechanical weathering, the breakage of rocks. And that is that all rocks are laced with microcracks. These are very small fractures inherent in the crystals, and they will grow via a process called subcritical cracking, which is cracking that happens at stresses less than that needed to break the rock catastrophically. And it's the propagation rather than the initiation of those fractures that's important. Let's look at cracking, subcritical cracking. Here we have a diagram of a crack within a mineral lattice, crystal lattice. And for that crack to grow, to extend, it has to break bonds, chemical bonds. The crack is sitting within an overall stress regime shown here, but the stresses are intensified right here at the crack tip because there is no stress carried across the crack surface. That tells you that as the crack gets longer, the stresses will get greater at the crack tip and the velocity will increase. That's what's illustrated on the right here, which is the crack velocity versus the stress intensity at the crack tip. And ultimately, we get to the strength of the rock, and then it breaks catastrophically. So this kind of subcritical cracking is what drives most of those mechanical weathering processes we can think of, whether we're thinking about it at the tectonic scale, mountain range scale, through these other variety of processes, and even this one shown here, the chemical alteration processes, for instance, biotite, hydrobiotite formation. It's like a little crowbar in the rock, and that will propagate fractures. All these processes are working sort of ubiquitously at low stresses to help break down rock. We'll turn next to chemical weathering reactions taking place within the critical zone. Geochemically, the rate of solute release is controlled by several parameters: mineral surface area, volume of fluid, stoichiometry, and the rate constant for a particular mineral. These in turn depend on mechanical weathering, hydrologic considerations, and the mineralogy and temperature through the Arrhenius relationship. A few weathering reactions are important for the carbon cycle. Silicate weathering driven by carbonic acid, followed by carbonate precipitation, yields a net reaction that locks CO2 from the atmosphere into carbonate rock. Carbonic acid is not the only proton source to drive weathering. Sulfide oxidation produces acid that can drive weathering reactions such as weathering silicates without consuming CO2, or weathering carbonates and releasing CO2. We have long known that mineral weathering rates measured in the lab are much faster than weathering rates measured in the field. This is thought to arise from the mineral surface age, as suggested by White and Brantley in this 2003 paper, but could also arise from shielding at surfaces by clays, oxides, or organics, or due to natural water limitations. This has led to a recognition recently that rainfall and mineral supply are important in controlling the global silicate weathering climate feedback. A paper by Sue Brantley and others, summarized here by Bob Hilton, suggests that silicate weathering is more temperature sensitive in areas of high mineral supply and rainfall over geologic time. interest is the role of mineral supply, which is in turn connected to erosion. To look at the role of rapid erosion on weathering fluxes, I'm going to take you to the Bench Glacier in the Chugach Mountains. It's a small glacier here near the town of Valdez, Alaska. Bench Glacier is on Greywacke bedrock, a real dog's breakfast of mineralogy. Two minor components, pyrite and carbonate, dominate the solute production. You can see that sulfide oxidation and carbonate dissolution account for 80% of the total dissolved salts. Low temperatures suppress the silicate weathering, while glacial abrasion continually feeds highly weatherable phases into the reactor. And this kind of behavior has been seen in glaciers worldwide. Here's a recent paper by Mark Torres, where he's showing that elevated pyrite weathering occurs underneath glaciers. He's plotting here the sulfate to sodium ratio versus the calcium to sodium ratio for in this top plot, and the glacial sites are the blue dots here, so they have elevated sulfate, elevated calcium. When he looks at magnesium as well as calcium, you can see the carbonate fields versus silicate versus evaporite fields. And basically, these are being dominated by sulfide oxidation driving carbonate release. He argues that this releases CO2 to the atmosphere and that glaciers would then provide a negative feedback on climate by increasing CO2 and warming the atmosphere. This has been seen in places with high erosion rate elsewhere. This is a recent paper on fast eroding catchments in Taiwan, where these fast eroding catchments are the ones that are eroding fastest are, again, undergoing sulfide oxidation coupled with carbonate dissolution, which is making them a CO2 source to the atmosphere at the highest steepness and erosion rate, whereas the catchments that are undergoing lower erosion rates are, in fact, carbon sinks. So let me turn now to the role of sediments in watersheds. Start with this slide, which I borrowed from Jérôme Gardier, in which he illustrates this thought that I've circled in red, that the river sediments plus the dissolved load together equal the bedrock in the catchment. And that is sort of like motherhood and apple pie, true at some level, but really most river systems are not this simple because sediment storage interferes. Let me illustrate with several examples. So I'm going to take you first to the tropics, and here's the Fly River in Papua New Guinea, where the construction of a copper mine and dumping of the tailings into the river system provided an inadvertent tracer of sediment across the floodplain. And what Day and others found in this analysis of the distribution, the spread of that copper across the floodplain is that 40% of the total sediment load was deposited on the floodplain, and it was deposited at distances up to 10 kilometers away from the main channel, with an average deposition rate of up to 6 to 9 millimeters per year in the places where it was highest, which is right along the channel. Here's a sediment deposition versus distance from the channel here. And you can see that it falls off rapidly, but it does spread all the way across the floodplain. If I take you to another river system, this is the Rio Bermejo in Argentina, which was worked on by Marissa Repash and Joel Scheingross, among others. And really, they can think of it as a huge flume. It's about 1,000 long extent of channel in which there are no tributaries. And so it's like they have this giant flume to study. And what they found is that there's it takes about 14 days for water to pass through that whole reach, that 1,000 kilometers. But sediment takes 8,500 years on average to travel through that same distance. Across all particle sizes, that sediment goes through 4 to 5 deposition erosion episodes along this entire reach. And so you can imagine that there is plenty of opportunity for weathering processes, for carbon accumulation, for carbon sequestration along that transit. And so if we go back to this beautiful image of Charles Bryan in Svalbard, we can think about the sediment that's generated. This is a glacier, obviously, and it is retreating. You can see the trim line here on the hillside and all glacial till that is left behind beneath that trim line, and also the outwash that is the fluvial sediments that are being generated and transported. And this is common in glacial systems. The idea that glacial sediments were very important and long-lived was first articulated by Church and Ryder in 1972, and they describe this process, the periglacial period, where upon deglaciation, the sediment yield from a catchment would be very high, removing all that excess sediment and relaxation from hill slopes, and then it would very slowly decline over time, ultimately getting back to the glacial or geologic rather norm, the rate of sediment production from hillsides in the absence of glaciers, and that this is going to lead to a landscape in which there are these sediment accumulations that are being slowly exhumed over time. This is what drove my thinking in this figure here about the effect of glacial erosion happening under the glaciers, but producing sediments that are long traveled far beyond the extent of the glaciers and persisting long after the glaciers retreat. This idea has been taken up recently to discuss the idea of dust transport and the importance of dust in the global system, using a very similar kind of framework, thinking about all the sediments that are produced. I've looked at this a little bit. Here are some loess profiles on a single moraine, but the loess, a 12,000-year-old moraine, but the loess is accumulated to different thicknesses on these different profiles, 25 centimeters up to 2.5 meters thick, all on the same moraine. And soil organic matter is found throughout these list profiles. So you can imagine that the rate of this deposition of sediment in the periglacial period is actually quite important in carbon. So let's think finally a little bit about river corridors, in which the rivers are migrating around, leaving behind and continually reworking surfaces adjacent to the active channel. The key attributes with respect to carbon of river corridors are the fact that there's disturbance going on, that there is erosion and deposition taking place across the corridor, and that there's vegetation and plant succession, and undoubtedly microbial processes going on as well. All of this is discussed by Renier in this lovely LOAC model, the land-ocean atmosphere continuum. Let's zoom in on the LOAC itself here and look at all the fluxes. And I'm particularly interested in the inland waters portion of this. And let me draw it in a way that I understand a little bit better. All of these fluxes that are drawn on the previous diagram, they are all involved or modulated by fluvial erosion. When I say erosion, I mean erosion and deposition. Let me just show you an example from our work on the Canning River in Alaska. This is my student, Cole Cochran, and he was just trying to quantify how much carbon is there on different alluvial surfaces up and down the Canning River. And what we found can be illustrated on the left here, that the amount of soil organic carbon that accumulated was against the profile age. We dated a number of these, was accumulating at a lower rate on drier, more disturbed surfaces, ones that you would expect to have less carbon because they had less time. And the wetter and older surfaces tended to have the highest carbon accumulation rates. Stay tuned, we're continuing to work on this. So really, rivers are these very dynamic systems with a variety of different ways that carbon can be stored and transported and sequestered, and that minerals can weather. So these are places of erosion and deposition. There are in-stream fluxes, of course, that matter a lot, and then carbon stocks that can form. So today I've tried to highlight in watersheds the weathering processes that are going on, that erosion and chemical weathering are linked, and that sediment is a really dynamic component of river systems. I thank you for your patience, and I hope to see you in Zoom tomorrow.
Excellent. So, right. Suzanne is in DC advocating on our behalf, and we are going to move on to Nicole Fernandez.
Hello, everyone. I would first like to start by thanking everyone for attendance today. I know it's been challenging, switching to a virtual sort of workshop here, but I think this has been really wonderful so far. And so I'm happy and really thrilled to share with you some work on in terms of reactive transport modeling and how this gives us information into various biogeochemical processes that are happening in the critical zone, which you've sort of briefly been introduced to through Suzanne Anderson's lovely work. And I'll be following up on that with some modeling. And you'll hopefully, by the end of this, sort of understand what reactive transport modeling is, what it can do, and what are some future work for that. So we'll spend most of the time working on water-rock interactions, and I know Suzanne has already sort of touched upon the climate weathering feedback, but I'll just quickly recap it again in terms of this major fundamental Earth surface process on which on land highly reactive meteoric water reacts with rock exposed at the surface and dissolves the mineral constituents, releasing a suite of dissolved products like metals, bases, nutrients, and so forth that are then mobilized through drainage networks and are eventually flushed to the ocean. And this process provides essential nutrients to both aquatic and land ecosystems and serves as a key role in regulating Earth's climate by CO2 sequestration. And so here there are two sort of major components of weathering that Suzanne has alluded to that can actually sequester CO2, and that is carbonate weathering. So that is the dissolution of calcium carbonate rock exposed at the surface, and silicate weathering, which is silica-bearing minerals, which is shown here in a very simplified format that is also able to release many different constituents here. And both of these are, as I said, major components for drawing down CO2. And you can see that carbonate weathering, which happens on shorter geologic timescales, so on the order of hundreds to thousands of years, can draw down 1 mole of CO2, but this is offset through marine organism facilitated calcium carbonate formation in the ocean. So over long timescales, the silicate weathering is the pathway that leads to long-term net CO2 drawdown over geologically relevant timescales. And to provide some perspective here, these are just some sort of estimate based on Jérôme Guéardet's work in 1999, looking at these large rivers and calculating these estimates of that silicate weathering globally can take down approximately 0.1 gigaton of carbon per year. The trade-off with this is that silicate weathering is generally slow and operates on the order of hundreds to thousands or even millions of years timescales. So weathering processes on land, they're complex, and like most Earth surface processes, operate across a variety of spatiotemporal scales, those that can originate on the pore scale, so basically at mineral water interfaces, and all the way to the regional basin scale. And so our challenge is to sort of link that together, and I'll sort of briefly, there are many ways to do it, but we'll spend most of our time looking at these processes through what is called the critical zone, or this thin veneer of the Earth's surface from the top of the canopy to bedrock that serves as the Earth's weathering engine. Sorry, I'm going to the next slide. So in the critical zone, the weathering engine has many components, but the easiest way to distill it is by sort of looking at this interplay between flowing water and mineral dissolution rates, which we show here as the CO2-rich rainwater interacting with a simple mineral, making up the parent lithology, which we're showing here as a northite. It's a major component of basalts. And so this interaction between rainwater and a northite breaks down the mineral and releases a variety of chemical species into the dissolved phase. Usually, if we stay here and have all of this subsurface water exported out of the catchment, we call this congruent dissolution. And this is usually what you would think of. Minerals dissolve, they release their constituents into the dissolved phase. This is exported out into rivers that are then transported out to the ocean over time. So this is the ideal case. But often what happens is that the surrounding water, as it takes in more dissolved species for mineral dissolution, becomes increasingly oversaturated with respect to secondary mineral phases like clays, and thus facilitate their formation. And these secondary clays scavenge these dissolved components and retaining them in soils. And this is a process that we call incongruent weathering. These two sort of processes, mineral dissolution and precipitation, work in tandem and are highly coupled, which is why you often see them together in weathering stoichiometries that you may have run into or encountered in the literature. And these two reactions importantly set the net drawdown for silicate weathering of that 2 moles of CO2. So now if we start to probe into the critical zone a little bit deeper by looking at this sort of cross-section that I'm depicting here as a hill slope, we can sort of start to incorporate other elements into sort of our weathering and look at how these water-rock interactions manifest themselves. And this is really dictated by first looking at mineral rate kinetics, which is the speed at which these water-rock interactions can occur. And this is described by this sort of classical transition state theory rate law description that is frequently used. And here, there are sort of 3 main dials of basalt weathering that can be turned to sort of increase these rates. So temperature, surface area, and of course, water. And the presence of water here may seem a bit obvious since we're talking about water rock interactions, but its influence extends beyond the presence of water, sort of invoked in the reaction stoichiometry. Actually, water flows and in this way can dictate the transportation of dissolved species away from the dissolving minerals. So let's explore this a bit further in terms of water routing. So water tends to flow and follows pathways in the subsurface that I'm highlighting here with my mouse here. And these are generally driven by landscape topography, but they don't necessarily need to be. And they exit at some point that I here show as a river with a person sort of sampling there. And the dissolved species generated from weathering can then follow this flow path. And this flow path is described by this ratio between the rates of the mineral dissolving and the flow rate here. And this is a sort of very important ratio here that sort of dictates what we actually observe in the river and how long basically reactions are allowed to occur. And with this, there's also to account for this effect of distance from equilibrium that you've seen here in the mineral dissolution reaction rate law and also here. And so what this means is that if water travels too fast, not much mineral dissolution can take place. And if the water is stagnant, the reaction becomes almost like a beaker, and the evolution of the dissolved species as we go down this flow path is dictated by the mineral dissolution rate. So these are how these two components work together. Now, of course, we have the complication of trying to disentangle these sort of mineral reaction rates with transport, but there's also biology that takes in place. And of course, I'm showing this in a very putrid way for those who are very involved in microbiology or even vegetation and ecology in terms of sort of one very simple pathway for organic carbon production. But microbial, soil microbiology, and sort of vegetation and biological pumping are important components that also sort of set and and transform a lot of biogeochemical cycling that's happening in the critical zone and impact what we ultimately observed in terms of river solute fluxes. So what we ultimately see is that there's a lot of variety of processes and integration of these different components in weathering reactions that sort of together work as a black box for us, where we have an infinite combination of these sort of different processes that contribute to what we ultimately see. So how can we start to tease apart these couple processes? And this is where reactive transport modeling can come in and serves a really interesting role. And the value of reactive transport modeling is that is a valuable tool to explore water-rock interactions and build hypotheses that it can inform both experimental work and field-based research in an iterative manner. And this is something that I've used a lot over the many years that I've been using geochemical models. And reactive transport is built upon this sort of canonical advection diffusion reaction equation that I'm showing here, in which we just take into account solute transport and also how it's transformed through this reaction terms. And both transport and the reaction equations can be solved simultaneously using numerical methods. And so this is how it looks like when we start to take to sort of simplify basically a system into a reactive transport modeling space where we can discretize it into this whole space into different boxes. And there we can track the flux in to every box and the flux out of every box. And within this box, because of mass conservation, we can track a lot of different components like fluid phase, solid phases, gases, and biomass, for example. And a lot of current and well-established reactive transport modeling has a lot of capabilities to basically characterize different reactions, like those that are aqueous, the mineral dissolution precipitation that we focus a lot on, adsorption, microbial respiration, and even things like isotopic exchange. So these are all sort of aspects and capabilities that are in reactive transport modeling. And for now, I'm going to sort of transition quickly into sort of two sort of examples that I've built from some of my work that I've done to sort of show you the capabilities of reactive transport modeling for this. So we'll start first with regolith building, which Suzanne had wonderfully described in terms of characterizing the sort of component of the weathering engine, the critical zone, so that the actual soils and saprolite and lithology that all constitute the regolith. So we'll start with our first example where RTM can allow us to build regolith over weathering timescales and evaluate these controls. And so we start basically in this example with an initial profile that this is basaltic bedrock, and we allow water to infiltrate through. And our idea is that we allow for different reactions to occur, like dissolution, precipitation, oxidation, and we track things like porosity, and we get this output of this modeled weathering profile. And sometimes we can compare this with observed stratigraphy here. And here are some of the variables that we played with in this model. And this is a sort of GIF time series showing the building of regoliths, starting with these basalt minerals that are these black and gray components at different temperatures from 0 to 25 degrees C. And as you can see, we're sort of looking at a regolith profile that's 100 meters deep with no erosion, and we're spinning this out to 100 million years with sort of these nice snapshots of these clays as they're starting to occur here, which are all these colored components. So what's very fun with these type of models is just looking at simple temperature effects, we can see that increasing temperature accelerates these regolith development. And these lower temperatures and at lower temperatures, there are secondary minerals that are not so favorably formed at higher temperatures that manifest themselves at these lower temperature scales. Further, we can use RTM based on these sort of simulations to predict the abundance of clays and the optimal climate conditions for them to form. So here are the set of clays that we sort of looked at before. So these are saponite, this is a magnesium-bearing smectite, kaolinite, this is an iron-bearing smectite and amorphous silica. And you can see on the y-axis we have different simulations that were run across different flow rates here and temperatures, and you can see the sort of where some of the maximum abundance of these clays would form in this given space. Another thing, another way we can use RTM in these simulations is to actually predict the sensitivity of these clay formations to different lithologies and really to the different mineral, primary mineral assemblages that make up the lithology. So here we had just a simple basalt lithology, but we're playing around with the percentage of plagioclase, pyroxenes, and olivines that make up that basalt. And you'll see here that, for example, these iron-bearing non-trinites are not very sensitive to the different contributions or percentages of olivine, plagioclase, and pyroxenes that make up those parent mineralogy, but kaolinite and saponite are. And then just to play a little bit on the redox timescale with redox reactions and the role of different gas phases, in particular oxygen, which is the major oxidant in this particular simulation, we can see that we can actually look at how increasing the oxygen gas component can facilitate the formation of these iron-bearing clay minerals and the development of the regolith, whereas we get up to higher and higher oxygen, of course, we're able to facilitate these higher, the formation of these iron-bearing clays. Okay, so that's one example. I'll quickly transition to briefly talking about the next example, which is sort of transitioning to a topic that you may have been familiar or have heard about in terms of this enhanced rock weathering, which is a sort of CO2 sequestration strategy that is sort of more and more popularly being discussed and implemented and tested. And so I wanted to take the time to actually show how we can actually look at and estimate CO2 consumption rates through enhanced rock weathering. And so the idea with enhanced rock weathering is that you apply this crushed basalt of high surface area over agricultural fields, which constitutes almost 44% of the world's habitable land and represents an area of about 48 million kilometers squared. And this actually leverages existing and well-established agricultural practices like liming that has been conventionally used. It has very convenient logistics and has a low barrier of entry, and there is a very low barrier of entry into enhanced rock weathering. So what can we do with a reactive transport model in this space, and how can we use this to sort of validate certain things on enhanced rock weathering? For that, we
Hi, Nicole.
can
Just
yep.
one more minute, okay?
Okay, one more
Yeah,
minute. Okay.
thank you.
Well, for sure. So I just am going to show quickly some of the results from this enhanced rock weathering, where we basically had a carbonate regolith 1 meters. And as you can see, we're sort of tested different climate scenarios from tropical, temperate, Mediterranean, semi-arid. And we can see that compared to baseline, CO2 consumption rates for the amended scenarios are much higher. As one would also expect, tropical climate yielded the highest CO2 consumption rates. And we see that CO2 consumption rates and drawdown capacity decrease sharply from one year to the next. We can also look at different secondary mineral formation and their contributions to reduce these basalt powder dissolution rates. We can actually calculate size and evolution of inorganic carbon pools, and we can actually track soil pH changes with depth, where when we look at the amended scenario, we see that soil pH can increase dramatically from something that's around 6 to around 8 to 10. And we can sort of estimate our results with those that have been compiled in the literature for enhanced rock weathering. So with that, here are the main takeaways for using reactive transport modeling. I hope that you've learned how useful a tool that it can be. And here are just some of the future of reactive transport modeling that are sort of being explored in this space that are really exciting, like using bioinformatics and geophysics in combination with reactive transport modeling to get at things we otherwise couldn't see in the critical zone. All right, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Really super, super interesting. I have lots of questions that I'll save for the panel. Next, we have Shuang Zhang from TAMU. Sorry, did I butcher? I'm so sorry if I butchered your name.
Okay,
great. And you're going to be talking about inorganic carbon transport, right?
Hey everyone, glad to be here. Today I would like to share with you the story of inorganic carbon transport through the river networks following enhanced weathering. So the scientific motivation about this topic is about climate change and carbon dioxide removal. And the overarching goal people want to achieve in this kind of topic is to put an upper bound of this net carbon capture efficiency of enhanced rock weathering from the river perspective. I'm glad that Nicole has also briefly mentioned this enhanced rock weathering. And so I will just go into my topic. So here you can see this figure highlighting these 10 popular carbon dioxide removal or CDR methods. And we already heard some great talks on these ocean-based CDR methods here. But now I will shift the gear to this land-based method, and the one I'm working on is enhanced rock weathering here. So although you see enhanced rock weathering is on land, however, it is actually linked closely to the river and ocean system, which you will see soon. So the principle of enhanced rock weathering is built on the basic mechanism of natural rock weathering. I know Suzanne and Nicole have already give a very good introduction of this rock weathering. I will briefly mention it here again, that we have two primary rock weathering on land that directly interact with this atmospheric CO2. One is silicated rock weathering, the other is carbonate rock weathering. The key message from these two weathering is that both weathering processes, they consume CO2 and convert CO2 to bicarbonate. In addition, these rocks will also release other ketyons and anions and also some nutrients. These bicarbonate and these ketyons and anions will be transported to the river, to the ocean, where they will stay in the ocean for thousands or tens of thousands of years. So that's why we call this rock weathering on this thousands of years of time scale is a cupping sink. Okay, so now you may wonder what the current rock weathering flux, meaning how much CO2 in the atmosphere can be captured by this rock weathering. Based on the classical work of Giladay in 1999, we have roughly 1 gigatons of CO2 or 0.3 gigatons of carbon per year can be captured by this natural rock weathering. This is a pretty big number, right? However, I know all of us know the current fossil fuel emission rate is around 37 gigatons of CO2 per year. So this big number just overshadows this 1 gigaton of CO2 per year captured by this natural rock weathering. That means if we want to use rock weathering to serve as a very efficient carbon capture method, we need to greatly accelerate this natural rock weathering process. So that's why we have something called enhanced weathering, or some people call it enhanced rock weathering here. So basically, the workflow as shown in this this cartoon that refers to mine rock there, and then we grind rocks into small powders, and then we spread these rock powders to the land, and specifically to the cropland. By having a higher surface area due to this the smaller size of this rock, you will have a much quicker CO2 reaction rate. So it will consume CO2 more quickly from this atmosphere. This is pretty good. In addition to CO2 capture, enhanced rock weathering also have some other co-benefits. For example, it can reduce the use of fertilizer. Why? Because rock weathering can release nutrients and some basic ketyons that can be used by the plants. They can also increase this soil pH and also can improve the soil property, and can also reduce this nitrous oxide emission by changing the soil pH. These are co-benefits for the soil, but we can also have co-benefits for the ocean. When this alkalinity generated from enhanced weathering carried by river to the ocean, it will also mitigate this ocean acidification event here, right? So EW is good. It is capture CO2, provide a lot of co-benefits, but what the real capture potential on a global scale? From here, you can see a couple of studies, and different studies will have a different number in this carbon capture potential on a global scale by enhanced rock weathering, due to they are using different methods to calculate the capture, and they are apply rocks to different regions in the world. However, the core idea of all these studies is the same. So basically, enhanced weathering can capture additional gigaton scales of CO2 per year. So this is pretty good. However, I want to emphasize there's there's one very important missing piece in this study, which is the downstream process of in-situ rock weathering. As we know, rock weathering occurs on land in the soil. However, when we release these ketyns, anions, and bicarbonate, they will be carried to the river. So when these fluxes go to the river, we will have a new carbonate state. Okay, then there might be two processes that can occur in the river. The first process is that if you have a lot of bicarbonate going to and calcium going to the river might have a super high saturation state in terms of carbonate saturation state, and then carbonate can be precipitated. If carbonate precipitates, then CO2 will be released back to the river and then from the river to the atmosphere. Second, even if this saturation state is not that high, we can still have a new CO2 level in the river given this incoming flux of this in-situ rock weathering. With a new PCO2 level in the river, we will have a new CO2 exchange rate between the river and atmosphere. So, roughly speaking, it is possible that some CO2 captured on land by rock weathering can be released by the river during its transport through the river to the ocean. So this is a big thing. So now to answer this question of how much carbon can be stored in the river, safely transported through the river to the ocean, and how much carbon will be lost in the river system, I will focus on two sub-topics. One sub-topic is to give you a brief overview of the impact of carbon precipitation on the net carbon capture potential of EW. The second subtopic will be to run a model to calculate how much CO2 will be lost to the from the river to the atmosphere due to a new PCO2 level in the river. I will start with this first subtopic, and this work is coming from my group. It is published in 2022. So basically, what we do is pretty straightforward. On the figure on the left, you can see the top one is for the US, the bottom one is for the global. So we compile this river station chemistry and other property for these available river stations in the US or on the global scale, and we calculated this baseline carbonate saturation state for all these stations. And then I will simulate this in-situ rock weathering on land by assuming a specific amount of rocks are reacting with CO2 and their products will be released to the river. I will do this gradually until the river now have a new carbonate saturation state. We also call it like omega value that can be as high as 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 25. The reason we have so big array of these omega values is because we don't know exactly the threshold that the majority of carbonate will be precipitating from the river. So I give a wide range here. I think this is a very good area in the future to dive into. But anyway, with this basic framework, I will be able to calculate the total amount of rocks in each river watershed that needed to be dissolved to drive the omega value to be these threshold values, and from that I can calculate how much CO2 is captured by this additional rock adding to this watershed. Okay, so the typical message for this study is that, as shown on the figure here, is that no matter you are using carbonate as this in-situ rock weathering feedstock, or you are using the basalt as this in-situ rock weathering feedstock, on this US scale, on this global scale, you have a very high carbon capture rate by this in-situ rock weathering here. Okay, so on a global scale, if you're using carbonate as this feedstock, you can capture additionally 2.5 to 8.8 gigatons of CO2 per year. And if you're using basalt as this feedstock, you can also capture 71 to 21.3 gigatons of CO2 per year. So this number is pretty big. That means from this river perspective and from this carbon precipitation perspective, our results kind of support the view that EW holds substantial CDR potential at this gigaton CO2 like scale. Our modeling study I want to see is also supported by another study by like NAP and Keeper 2022. They focus on not all the available river stations on a global scale. What they focus is on these 149 major rivers across the global scale, and they achieve a carbon transport potential of 3.4 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is very, very similar to our global CTP estimate of 3.5 to 3.9 gigatons CO2 per year. I will also want to highlight the difference here is pretty interesting. Our number is a little bit higher. One reason is due to this calculation method, but I also feel the other reason is that we focus on all the rivers, small rivers, middle rivers, big rivers, and we know the small rivers can have like a higher PCO2 level in general, so we can have a bigger capacity to receive this in-soil rock weathering products. So this small river actually is pretty important, also as highlighted by like David Butman. This is like a small river important in this whole river system. So now, and these two projects, they are showing from this carbon precipitation perspective, it's okay. We have big potential to transport this in-soil rock weathering products. However, there are two limitations of this previous study. First is that rivers are disconnected. We treat each river station or this watershed independent. They are not connected together. So we are not able to track these carbon fluxes from one to another. Second, that although we assume carbon will precipitate like a threshold, but we never track this explicit CO2 exchange between the river and the atmosphere. So to tackle that, this is a subtopic 2. I'm building a new model. It's called like a dynamic river network like model. The overarching goal of building this model is to be able to provide to the community a tool that using this model you can deploy any in-soil rock weathering anywhere in the US and hopefully in the future to the global scale. That this model can help you to track how much carbon will flow from the upstream to the downstream until to the ocean. So there are like 3 steps here. Basically, the first step is to compile the river parameter. Second step is to using machine learning to extrapolate these river stations, scattered river station to all the river segments. The third step is to build this dynamic river network model that help you to track this carbon flow through all these segments. And finally, we will implement EW on anywhere, and we can use this model to track these river responses and this carbon loss in the river. So I will briefly mention this is one project here. We basically randomly select 100 watersheds across this entire river network. We are focusing now, as you can see, is in the US and North America because it is most data abundant. And we apply this EW in each watershed, and we run this DRN model for 2 years. For each individual river flow path, we will be able to track how much carbon is lost due to this CO2 exchange between the atmosphere and this like river. As you can see here, the good news is that for majority of the river, we don't have much like carbon leakage. The majority, like 92% of this flow path is exhibited pretty low, less than 5% of cumulative carbon leakage. Okay, this is pretty good. However, you can also see these 2 sides have big carbon leakage. I don't see it here, but please feel free to check out this paper. It means this hydrology and this amount of basalt applied is pretty important in controlling this carbon leakage. I will also briefly mention 2 ongoing work. One is that the previous work is focused on this single river segment. Now we are trying to refine the model to expand from single flow simulation to multiple flow simulation. So we pick a site here, very close to this mining site, and we just draw a buffer zone 150 kilometers, and we apply rocks everywhere in this buffer zone, and we will be able to track them all together from all these river flows to the ocean. So this is the result. We still get a pretty low number, cumulative carbon leakage to below like 2%. And also, more interestingly, we can also track this carbon ejection change in this buffer zone and below and following this this buffer zone. This is like a GIF file, and this is the work we are working with now. And the story continues. Although my talk is inorganic carbon transport through river, but organic carbon And metabolism thing is pretty important, as you can see from these two figures. One is published by Newman 2025. You can see clearly the rate of photosynthesis will change with the pH value in the river. So as ERW or EW you will change this pH value in the river, this photosynthesis will also change. So this effect should also be considered like in the future. On the figure on the right, it also see with this like PIC increasing from land to the river, you will also have a change in the CO2 degassing due to the decomposition of this organic carbon rate change, because higher pH due to this EW will drive the increase of decomposition of DOC. We will have more CO2 emission. So to tackle that, our group is also working with other groups. We are trying to use machine learning to predict this photosynthesis and this respiration thing like here. Hopefully we will have some results like soon. With that, I want to thank all my collaborators. And with that, I will happy to answer questions during the panel. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I hope that river metabolism incorporation work proceeds. That'll be really interesting. So next up, we have Jennifer Bowen from Stanford. Hi, Jennifer. And you're going to be now switching over a little bit to talking about organic matter transport.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all the organizers of this session. It's been a great workshop so far, and I'm excited for the rest of the talks of this session. Today, I'm going to be talking about the export and fate of dissolved organic matter from land, and specifically what happens in the headwaters and how this has an impact on organic matter fate downstream. So we know from work over decades that dissolved organic matter is exported from land to fresh waters. This is a large flux, and whether it ends up in the coast or undergoes degradation to greenhouse gases and is released to the atmosphere has a large impact on the carbon budget. One of a recent study estimated that upwards of 300 teragrams of carbon may be exported as DOC to the coast, and a large part of this coming from rivers. And so this really demonstrates the importance of this carbon flux between land and the ocean, which is also changing with climate and land disturbance. And so my research focuses on how the fate of DOC is changing along this continuum, how it's changing with disturbance, with climate, and a large part of it is actually focused in the headwaters. So in streams and canals, draining freshwater wetlands. And this is because this is where a lot of carbon is exported, as you've heard from some of the earlier talks in the session. It's also where a lot of disturbance is happening with the potential to impact DOC export and fate. And one of the ways that a disturbance should impact the fate of DOC is with deforestation. So here's just a photo of a stream that's getting exposed to light throughout the day. And you can imagine deforestation increases opportunities for DOC to undergo sunlight-driven photochemical degradation. And this is on top of microbial processes that are already breaking down DOC to greenhouse gases. And so today I'll talk about some of the work I've done in two ecosystems undergoing change: a temperate forested stream undergoing deforestation or from years and years ago that are just getting exposed to sunlight. And then also a tropical peatland ecosystem that has undergone deforestation and drainage in more recent years. For this temperate stream, much about the stream hasn't changed, but we're getting increases or changes in DOC export, changes in the exposure of that DOC to sunlight. And in contrast, in the tropical peat ecosystem, a lot more has changed. So the avenues of DOC export has changed because there are much more canals across the landscape, which are designed to drain water from the soil. This has increased opportunities for DOC to undergo degradation before reaching rivers or estuaries. And you can imagine they're also getting exposed to sunlight throughout the day. And so with these disturbances, And within these two ecosystems, my research is focused on these two fundamental questions. The first being what pathway drives DOC degradation in these headwaters, and how does degradation in headwaters impact downstream DOC fate? And I hope to provide these two ecosystems as examples because they represent very two different ecosystems. The one, the temperate forest, is very low DOC. It has a different climate than in the tropics, and the tropical peatland ecosystems has high DOC, much lower pH. So first I'll start with work in temperate forested streams in Pennsylvania. So part of this work involved measuring the different pathways of DOC degradation and quantifying those degradation rates. So here microbial respiration was quantified using biofilm reactors to mimic microbial respiration in the stream sediment. Waters were also exposed to direct sunlight to measure rates of photomineralization. And then also that sunlight exposed water was fed to these stream microbes to measure the effect that has on respiration. And as many of you know from carrying out work on DOC degradation, it's important to measure or estimate those daily rates in the field in situ to compare the importance of these different pathways for degradation and to get at that total DOC degradation rate throughout the day. But oftentimes we're limited in how we can transfer results obtained in experiments or in the lab to measurements taking place in situ. And so to get at this transfer of results, we related the uptake velocities within these bioreactors to uptake velocities within the stream, and then also getting at the amount of light absorbed by DOM within the experiments. We could relate that back to the extent of light absorption taking place during the day in the stream. And so from this approach, here I'm going to show the results with daily rates of DOC degradation on the y-axis for these three pathways: microbial respiration, photomineralization, and the photo-enhanced respiration caused by that sunlight exposure of DOC. And what we found is that respiration is the major degradation pathway in the system. It accounted for more than 90% of total degradation, with a much minor fraction coming from that photomineralization or the impact photodegradation had on respiration. And so despite there being sunlight exposure in the system, respiration still drives DOC degradation is the major pathway for this in the system. So switching to the tropical peat ecosystem with these canals draining the land. This work was carried out in West Kalimantan, Indonesia, which I'm showing here as with a yellow star. This area has many coastal peatlands along the coast, shown in the light brown reddish color, and canals are dug across the landscape. And so measuring DOC degradation rates in these canals looked a little different. For this work, we measured microbial respiration using bottle incubations and also quantified photomineralization and the photo-enhanced respiration rates using this approach. And part of this was because the how respiration changes as a function of depth is very different. So here, we have the same goal of estimating those daily rates in situ to compare the pathways and also estimate total DOC degradation. But in this system, because of the really high DOC, you get rapid consumption of oxygen. There isn't a ton of mixing. There's not always continuous flow. And so respiration was quantified as a function of depth, with the majority of respiration taking place in the water column. So from this work, we found that photochemistry is actually the major degradation pathway. So here again, I'm showing DOC degradation to CO2 on the y-axis for these three different avenues of CO2 production. And you can see they're all pretty similar with photomineralization and this photo-enhanced respiration making up about 2/3 of the total DOC degradation rate. And putting this on the same scale as what I was showing previously for the temperate stream, you can see the rates are much lower. So microbial respiration was much lower due to the lower oxygen availability. And the DOC here is much higher aromatic content. It just takes longer for the microbes to break it down to CO2. But on the other hand, the photomineralization and photoenhanced respiration were much higher. And so this is what, between these factors, what led to photochemistry being the major pathway. So now comparing these two systems, respiration dominating degradation in this temperate forested stream, photochemistry dominating DOC degradation in the tropical peatland canals. And this was largely due to oxygen limiting aerobic respiration in the canals. And on the other hand, the availability of DOM limited the extent of photochemistry in these streams because there's more light coming in than there is DOC available to absorb that light. Another key difference between these two ecosystems was the total DOC degradation rate to CO2, which was much higher in the temperate forested stream, and also the percent of DOC within the water column that underwent degradation to CO2. So this is partially due to DOC degradation dropping off with depth within the canals. The photic zone is very shallow compared to many of the systems I'm sure many of you think about. Can be anywhere between 5 centimeters and 20 centimeters of the surface. And then respiration can drop off very quickly with low oxygen availability. And so, so hopefully this gives you an idea of how different the major pathways can be between systems undergoing a similar extent of change, but the fundamental drivers of DOC degradation are different, and how that's changing with disturbance is also different. And so this brings me to the second question of this work, which was how degradation in headwaters impacts downstream DOC fate. One of the key results that we've noticed over the years is, so this is a result from the stream in Pennsylvania. We see lower DOC lability after longer sunlight exposures. So here I'm showing on the y-axis the percent change in respiration by microbes using those bioreactors versus the amount of light absorbed by DOM on the x-axis. And you can think of this as the sunlight exposure time in the canal. These values correspond to about hours of exposure in the stream. And so you can see after longer exposures, you start to see a negative impact of sunlight exposure on respiration, suggesting lower and lower lability as the DOC is increasingly exposed to sunlight. And we actually see the same thing in the tropical canals. So here I'm now showing the CO2 that's photomineralized from DOC at the sunlit surface in the canal. This time I am plotting it versus an estimated exposure time in the canal under average conditions. And you can see the highest rate of CO2 production occurs after the lowest exposure time, and that starts to drop off with increasing sunlight exposure towards the end of the day. Our more recent work is focused on characterizing degradation products via these two pathways using tandem mass spectrometry. So this involves liquid chromatography mass spec and a suite of informatics tools to characterize degradation products and assign library annotations. And so I'm not going to get too much into these results, and I'm just going to give one example in the tropical canals for the photochemical degradation products characterized. So what we're seeing right now is that there's many degradation products characterized using this method. This is about 950 products that are consistently observed across different canals on the landscape following sunlight exposure. And here are just a couple examples of the library annotations that we're able to get from using this method. And there's many other informatics tools that can be used to assign additional details like the types of functional groups or the compound class that they are assigned to. And another thing I wanted to point out is many of these photoproducts are actually classified as CRAM-like. So a lot of our ongoing work is focused on understanding how much of these are actually less labile to microbes in the canals. But if these are readily formed over these short sunlight exposures in the canal, this could suggest that we are actually rapidly getting the production of DOC with lower lability to microbes in these headwaters before it even enters a river. And so this has implications for the fate of DOC downstream past these canals and streams. And we can think of this in the broader context of this land-ocean continuum. If you have extensive DOC degradation taking place in streams and canals before they even reach a river, then this will have implications for the lability of this DOC entering rivers and estuaries and will impact this flux. And as the disturbances continue to impact streams and canals, especially in the tropics, which I've highlighted in this bar graph on the right, the dark bar graphs show tropical regions and their DOC flux. You can see that they contribute the majority of DOC fluxes, at least from this study. And so what this means is as tropical ecosystems continue to undergo disturbances such as land use change or deforestation, this should have large implications for DOC export to the coast. And so I'll just leave my takeaways up here. Land disturbance has increased the impact of photochemistry on DOC fate. Many of these factors of photochemistry and microbial respiration impacting DOC fate and undergoing degradation differs between low DOC and high DOC waters. And then also in these headwaters, you have rapid change in DOC lability that we should be accounting for when thinking about the downstream fate in rivers and estuaries. And I'd like to acknowledge all the co-authors of these two studies, and especially the partnerships that we've developed with the Nature Conservancy Indonesia and Tanjung University to create a collaborative group working on topics related to tropical peatlands. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so next up we've got Blake Clark from NASA, and this is going to be more of a case study. Is that correct? He's going to take us to the Arctic.
Actually, not going to go to the Arctic today, although that is where the majority of my work is has been focused over the last few years. Today, I'm going to talk about really what has been the outcome or one of the a genesis of the my involvement with the NASA mission of the carbon monitoring systems. So this is really a group effort where we are looking at carbon or how we can incorporate the concept of including the transport and lateral connectivity of ecosystems into carbon markets. So this is kind of like the TLDR of the talk, where we have like a very complex landscape now, right? We have agriculture, wetlands, urban areas, and then we have a large flux of organic and inorganic carbon and alkalinity coming into the ocean from land. So in an ideal world, every greenhouse gas molecule would have to be offset, right? And paying to remove these greenhouse gases would incentivize reducing emissions. But currently, the voluntary carbon markets utilize standards and practices that treat the lateral hydrologic connectivity and export conservatively. The flux of carbon and alkalinity from land to sea in between potential project boundaries. So we're talking about like if you have a forest and a wetland downstream as these projects. And then also between countries and regions is substantial and should be accounted for. And right now within CMS and globally, we're building a capacity to account for this lateral connectivity and export of carbon and alkalinity. so that will go to my next, kind of taking a broad view, and then I think Ben's speaking later today, and so he'll dive into this aspect of the global carbon project. But we have this large amount of CO2 that's being fixed by terrestrial ecosystems, but over half, 64% of that CO2 goes into the land ocean aquatic continuum. And eventually, we have about 0.95 petagrams of carbon per year, or 950 teragrams, exported to the ocean. But a lot of things are happening along the way, where we have high spatial variability, and there's a dependence on land cover, the reservoirs, and obviously human impacts into the carbon cycle. And there's a large loss of CO2 from inland waters themselves. And so regionally, this can be substantial, but we want to try to understand how this export could potentially factor in to the accounting on a more local scale. So still focusing on the global scale, the lateral flux from land to sea until recently was a missing piece of the global carbon project, where it was where the goal of the global carbon project is to understand how human impacts affect the carbon cycle, right? So to do that, you need to know the pre-industrial carbon cycle, and Pierre Renier and others have constructed, with a lot of analysis and reanalysis of data, this idea of these loops between land and ocean. And before humans, there was a net degassing based off of this analysis of 650 teragrams of carbon from the oceans. That was mostly due to inputs from inland waters or rivers to the ocean, right? It was essentially an ecosystem imbalance, or a semi-steady state. So when we add in the impact of humans, there's obviously a huge shift in the carbon cycle, where we have the emissions, and now essentially the oceans are a large sink of carbon. The terrestrial ecosystems have become a greater sink of carbon, but also the flux from land to sea has increased by about 100 teragrams per year. And so the lack of the explicit representation of the lateral fluxes in ocean models can bias the sink to be greater than it is in reality. And so with the newest budget put out by GCP, they prescribed a boundary condition for the ocean models, which was better than it was before. And it was regionally dispersed. And I'll go talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But by not including the land ocean flux, it can lead to a discrepancy between top-down inversions, which measure the atmospheric CO2 over time, and then bottom-up approaches, which try to account for carbon on the landscape or in the ocean. So we just kind of got introduced to this paper where we have this new spatially resolved estimate of the carbon flux from land to sea, and it's been increased a little bit from Renier by about 8% to about 1 petagram per year. And you have 100 to 300 teragrams of that carbon going into the ocean due to human activity. That's bracketed by both of these investigations. So we know that humans are impacting the carbon cycle from land to sea, and we want to try to include that impact, but not just from a reanalysis level, but a mechanistic level. And so we need this robust mechanistic linkage between land use and land change and river and reservoir processes, which we've heard about this morning, and estuarine and coastal ocean dynamics, which we'll hear about later today. And that will complete the picture and allow the models that are used for climate projections to be better at predicting the impacts of humans on the carbon cycle into the future. A brief reflection. We're at the cusp of having a suite of models developed and integrated into global climate models, which enable a dynamic LOAC instead of a prescribed condition or mass balance approach. And without support to fund projects like the GCP and missions like NASA's carbon monitoring system, the basic research and technology development to do this would not be possible. We have the supercomputers, we have the knowledge, we have the technical ability, and now is the time to do this, where we can construct models that are complete for the Earth ecosystem with the rivers included. Okay, so now we're shifting to a little bit why this matters for carbon accounting. And so I'm sure most of you have seen this. If you go to book a flight, you can reduce your carbon impact by flying by buying carbon credits, right? And so the question is like, well, like, why does the airlines just pay this or build it into the cost of a ticket? But also, like, the main question for us as scientists is, are these carbon credits actually reducing CO2 in the atmosphere? Like, are we paying for, or are the companies paying for actual emissions reductions? And it's a complicated process for nature-based carbon projects. For things like, you know, if you shut down a coal plant or you sequester CO2 into the ground, it's relatively easy to calculate the additionality or the amount of emissions reduction from that source. But for nature-based climate solutions, it can be quite complicated. And this is just one of several flowcharts that are used for carbon projects in calculating the amount of emissions reductions. And here's another complicated diagram showing that when it comes to organic carbon especially, there's tons of there's a complicated matrix of reactions that affect the reactivity, which was really just described quite well previously. And so when we think about incorporating this into the amount of carbon that's exported from the landscape, we need to try to build a better definition of these terms, including leakage, which is the net change of anthropogenic emissions by greenhouse gas sources that occur outside of a project or program boundary, but are attributable to the project or program. And I'm not going to go through these other terms, but I encourage you to read the Vera guidelines and definitions, because the basic premise is that without the monetary incentive of the market, the additional or the reduction in atmospheric greenhouse gases beyond the baseline would not have occurred. Okay, so now let's think about the landscape, right? So we have projects potentially, and this paper really outlines how by measuring aquatic carbon, you can kind of account for the net change of the overall landscape. And so this figure, which is similar to the one I showed at the top, and this paper by Casas Ruiz et al. Describes how the measuring of the aquatic carbon can inform the net uptake of the landscape. And so when carbon projects that are being implemented to reduce emissions or sequester CO2, particularly for forests, which we'll talk about today, they have, specific guidelines on what has to be measured. And for a forest, you can take a census-based approach, which is like you go out and you count every tree, kind of, and the amount of biomass, or an area-based approach, where you can calculate or estimate the above and below ground biomass. And you can see that there's no term for the amount of export that's coming from these systems, right? Potentially, if you measure the soil organic carbon and litter and all the terms with the area-based approach that are optional over time, then you would be able to back calculate the export. But those are only optional if it leads to an increase in potential emissions. Okay, so here's like a small case study from Maryland, which I put together over the last few weeks. And this utilizes the Patuxent watershed and a new estimate of above ground biomass from George Hurt, who is the leader of CMS, actually. And so this paper estimates the change over time of above ground biomass at a 30-meter resolution. And so this can serve as our kind of hypothetical project for the Patuxent watershed, where if we say like the Patuxent watershed essentially is being utilized as the not the control, but the project area. So you can see the change in biomass over time. It's about 0.2 teragrams of carbon, so not much, but if you think about carbon credits, that's quite a bit. And with that, utilizing measurements of DOC and alkalinity from the Chesapeake Bay program and USGS discharge, we can estimate the flux from that ecosystem. And you can build rating functions with the constituents that are important and calculate that a daily flux over time. And then a cumulative summation of the exported carbon. So over that same time period, where we had a net increase of biomass of 0.2 teragrams, there's a net export of 0.45 teragrams of DOC and 0.06 teragrams of alkalinity. So the export was greater than the net change in the biomass of the watershed. The question is, well, what's the fate, right, of that DOC that's going into the Chesapeake Bay and the alkalinity? And conservatively, we can try to say that maybe a fraction of that is actually sequestered or remains in the water. And this is my last slide, Shaily. Another consideration is like the project boundaries, right? So within the Patuxent River, it's not just a river, it's not just a pipe. There's tons of wetlands that lie downstream of where these inputs are coming in from the forest. And this is the concept of the connectivity between potential carbon projects, and it requires the holistic and cooperative interaction between managers of these systems. And I'll leave it at that. And this is a picture from the Arctic, the Colville River. So
Thanks, Blake. Sorry for misrepresenting your talk.
no word.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. That great talks so far, like fantastic talks. We're going to take it away with Tom Bianchi. So Tom is going to be talking more about carbon processing in critical zone.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's always a real pleasure to be at OCB. And I'd also like to thank many of the organizers at OCB for being so forthright in being positive for some of the younger scientists during these tough times during the meeting. So I think it's been great listening to that. So I'm going to finish this session, which I was very impressed by my co-speakers here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about linkages between POC. We've heard about DOC and sediments from Suzanne and Jennifer, and I'd like to think about LOAC in terms of, some of the key questions here are going to be looking at some of the spatial and temporal dynamics across these different, very, very heterogeneous land-ocean habitats, and the complications with the Anthropocene as well. And the relevance of that, of course, is related to a lot of things we've heard about already in terms of just how much is exported, this outgassing question, where materials being buried, and again, some of the geomorphological dynamics that link with the terrestrial organic carbon cycle. So if you look back 30 years or so, some of the luminaries in our business, like John Hedges, was thinking about questions. John, being an oceanographer, talked frequently with the soil science community. And he started thinking about how important petrogenic and kerogenic material was, how much it's completely oxidized. This is something that Bob Berner thought about as well. What types of refractory biochemicals are important in this carbon cycle? And what are the factors that control organic transport from land to ocean, right? So this all sounds familiar. You go back a little bit further to Van Oort with the river continuum concept. This is a more ecosystem-based, ecological extension of what was being developed at that time. 30, 40 years ago, biogeochemistry was still developing, even though its early inception comes further back. We were just sort of moving into these integrative kinds of questions. And in this particular RCC concept, you see essentially that it's more trophic dynamically controlled in terms of what's actually being consumed. You have coarse particulate material, eventually finer material coming in further down, different consumers. And the whole idea was based on this conservation of energy, of leakiness, as we've heard Blake just mention, how these leak systems can in fact be leaky or not very leaky. So this goes back, this is not the latest. It was, as Blake mentioned, Renier published a more recent paper on this, as well as Drake had another paper as well. So these numbers are not up to date, but the idea here is very simply going back to what John Cole and others originally started thinking about, was this pipe, this very simplistic view that the connection from the upper watershed to the ocean was not very exciting in terms of this flush of material that makes it with not a lot of reactivity in terms of what we thought about with soil, organic matter, and terrestrial material. But you can see here that there is, in fact, a lot of, as Blake was mentioning, there's a lot of CO2 loss and a lot of processing going on. So basically, some of this material gets consumed very quickly in the early stages, as you can see in some of the streams and upper watershed. But yet some of it actually does, in fact, make it to the ocean and can be stored for long periods of time. So is there a difference between the material that's entering at different stages of this pipe? Another thing that has evolved with time, of course, this paper by Schmidt back in 2011 talks about some of the older ideas of condensation reactions, molecular structure being important in terms of what types of organic matter are more labile or recalcitrant. And of course, this has evolved into this more nuances of organomineral interactions, which has just taken off tremendously as a very important dynamic. And you can see here that this is a paper that looks at this silicate particle and the components of organic matter. The phyllosilicates, in particular, clay particles, are particularly important. Other work has shown, Hemingway published a paper that what is it about this bonding between organic carbon and minerals, and that it really turns out to be the strength of the bonding of the organic carbon bond to the mineral structure and what it takes to get that material off from microbes. And that makes a huge difference. So once protected, rather than just this detrital material coming in, if it's protected by minerals, once protected, where do these particles get stored in these vast basins between the mountains and the coast? And those basins are the floodplains. We heard a little bit about that from Suzanne earlier. And basically, you can see these vast areas. Only 5 to 20% of the eroded material actually makes it to the ocean. So you do have long periods of time, and you can see typical time span up to 18,000 years, from minutes to many, many thousands of years. And so these large floodplains are the highways that actually control these meandering rivers. And as they change paths, the deposition of these particular floodplains change. So we heard about this earlier from Suzanne in terms of some of these vast floodplains in South America. You can see here, this is the Beni and Mamor River area here. You can see distance from the channel. This is the rate of accumulation in centimeters per year. Some of these things are oscillating with El Nino southern oscillations in terms of rainfall and so on. You can have huge amounts of material laid out in these vast floodplains, 20 to 100 centimeters of sediment in days. You can see the kind of accumulations that are, again, part of these vast depositional places where the rivers are meandering and depositing. And remember, most of the sedimentary rocks on the planet, 60% of them are made up of mudstones. So it's really the mud that's actually storing and carrying this organic matter. So what's the Anthropocene doing? If you look on the left side, you see this is between 1950 and 2010 on the right. You can see that all of these types of land use changes, of course, with climate warming as well, we've boosted the delivery or movement of sediments by 215%. However, we've decreased the amount reaching the coastal ocean by about 49%. A lot of that's related to damming. And then, of course, there's a huge amount of consumption from humans. So we published a paper recently on looking at the anthropogenic effects of what I consider to be this reactive medium, clay particles, silt particles, which we commonly call mud. And how is this mud moving across the landscape? We know it's carrying organic matter. We know that it can protect material, but it can also be very reactive. And so we're looking at some places where you see increases and decreases of its mobilization. Most of the places have seen net increases in mountain glacial areas, dam regions, river export, permafrost, and so on. And of course, we'll hear a little bit about this in the next part of this session. The tidal flats and floodplains are somewhat more questionable in terms of net gain or net loss. Now, as mud moves in rivers, we've known that that typically is part of the suspended load as opposed to the bed load, which is coarser. But we do have found recently that there are lots of flocculated material. We know that occurs typically in estuarine systems once you start mixing in cations with these particles, generally negative particles. And so what we have seen more recently is that flocculation does occur in fresh waters. A lot of that's related to organic coatings and mucus type material, different than the charge difference as you move from fresh to saline water. But the interesting thing this paper points out is that actually you do find more of a connection between the surface part of the bed load and that material flocculating down and getting re-entrained back up. Now, why is that important? Again, remember, it's the stickiness of the mud particles that's quite important in terms of building banks around these rivers as they meander and move. So again, the stickiness carrying organic matter and this regeneration of particles as they move up and down in these rivers more than we previously thought. Again, this is the paper I was mentioning that Suzanne had mentioned earlier, where she talked about this as being this giant flume virus, Pat. Wonderful paper. And you can see again, where's POC getting delivered? in this flume, as she described. If you look further downstream, this is from up near the mountains. This is downstream. This is the amount of POC flux, kilograms of carbon per second, times 3. And you have different pools here, less than 4, greater than 4 microns. So this is in the very, very fine fraction. But nevertheless, the point is that you see that there's a huge increase from up at the head streams down, further down, as you collect this material for a greater amount, 78% of the total POC load being bound in these very, very fine phyllosilicate types of particles. That would be the clay particles less than 4. Greater than 4, you'd get into silts, which could be very quartz-like and not be so conducive for organic matter entrainment. This is a bit more complicated. This is a really, really interesting paper by Eglinton, Tim Eglinton, and a bunch of people, lots of really good collaborators, about 36 globally distributed river systems. They collected samples from these different areas that have been stored for periods of time from various workers and so on. And what we have here is mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation on the x-axis. And if you look here on the y, you'll see C14 age. Now, what are all these points indicate here? The circles and the squares here are 2 types of biomarkers: lipids, fatty acids, let's say, and lignin, both indicators of significant components from the terrestrial systems, right? And what we see here, if we just look at these 2 types of biomarkers with respect to temperature and precipitation, we see essentially that the reactivity of these particular systems increases with, or the reactivity of the organic matter in the soils that they were looking at and the other matrices that they looked at in these systems basically increase with temperature and increase with precipitation. These triangles here represent the basically the soil turnover. So the soil turnover follows the same track as the biomarkers, or I should say the biomarkers are following the same track as the soil turnover. This is very encouraging across very divergent systems. And the whole idea that you can actually integrate something like that provides great possibilities for looking at future directions of how the larger floodplains are reacting with respect to organic delivery, storage, reactivity. And it was somewhat unexpected considering the fact that they're so divergent. Now, of course, as you go to the northern latitudes, because this covered such a great latitudinal range, of course, in the northern latitudes, you have the effect of permafrost interfering possibly with other temperature effects, because that's a pre-aged material, similar to the petrogenic, only even more extreme with petrogenic. So I'll get to that in just a moment. But again, I think this paper illustrates the possibility of or the potential of this soil carbon turnover times and the application of age, compound specific and bulk, implies ways to move forward on looking at broader changes. Still separating out global warming effects versus land use change can still be very difficult, because temperature and precipitation impact natural versus land use change kinds of things in very similar ways, right? So last few slides I have here are that petrogenic material. We heard about this a little bit earlier. This is really taken on, and this goes back to what Hedges was asking, and Berner and others have thought about for years. Again, some of the rates of oxidation here counter the natural weathering process of uptake that we heard earlier from Suzanne. So it can be quite significant. This is a paper again suggesting the importance of petrogenic organic oxidation as you move across the floodplain in the Amazon, right? So there's been a lot of work that has suggested the possibility of that, and most of that work has been done by modeling and using radiocarbon and sedimentation rates, not direct measurement of microbial uptake of petrogenic material. There were early attempts by Petch back in 2001, which hinted to that, but the techniques have come much further along. And this recent work from Rubin in Svalbard talks about some of these bacterial communities can utilize up to 55% of this petrogenic organic carbon. And again, why would an organism choose to eat that? Certainly, they speculate that some of it does maybe come down to resource limitation. I think there could also be some potential priming effects there as well, but this is a very new area developing. So, as I mentioned, we also have the basically destruction of the Arctic as it starts to thaw, and we're releasing tremendous amounts of this pre-aged material in the rivers. So again, staying with the river theme, we've talked about terrestrial organic matter, mud, a little bit about this petrogenic material, and now permafrost. And you have seen many papers on this. It's very strongly linked with greenhouse gas linkages as it melts, thaws, I should say. We had a paper back in 21 that looked at the Colville River Delta up in Alaska. It's continuous permafrost. This is the Colville Delta. These are some rivers here, the Akillic River in particular that we looked at. And what we find, essentially, there's been a lot of work that's looked at the release of DOC derived from permafrost into rivers, and it doesn't last very long. It burns up very quickly or is oxidized very quickly. We're curious about the POC, and sure enough, you do in fact see these very long-chain fatty acids in the delta that reflect what you see up in the permafrost regions, 2,000, 3,000 years old. Uncommon to find long-chain fatty acids like that if it's not coming from permafrost. And of course, this is from this huge amount of bank erosion that's occurring now. And you can see these chunks of permafrost or yedema, and some people call it, depending upon your definition, being transported out to the coast. So again, this pulsing or this rapid rate comes back to some of the other sort of fundamentals of that RCC that Pete Raymond and others have talked about with flooding events and the flushing and the residence time of carbon moving through these river systems as we start to get more flooding and different rainfall events, whether you're talking tropical or thawing with the Arctic. So the final slide I have, just a little bit off base, but this is some work we're doing in the Yellow River, Huanghe. Very, very well-known global river system, well-known for its sediment load that has dropped substantially from all of these various dams. This is the Shaily Dam. And basically, one of the interesting things, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of POC that gets trapped behind this. Of course, there can be lots of interesting things going on with methane and CO2, greenhouse gas exchange. The other thing that happens downstream of these dams is downstream erosion. And the last thing I just mentioned here is that most people think of the dams impacting primary production in terms of clearing as the water clears or the light availability goes up, you get more phytoplankton. But there's also petrogenic material because of this erosion going on that's actually accumulating behind the dams. And this is another interesting dynamic of the Anthropocene as it relates to some of this ancient carbon. So I'll just finish by saying a couple of key points here. Inland waters transport, transform, and emit huge amounts of these greenhouse gases. And again, we need to constrain the terrestrial system better. Mineral-associated POC is very important in this as it relates to mud. And again, these local controls of stocks and biomarkers and radiocarbon offer potential to do these large-scale comparisons. And again, petrogenic is much more important than we ever thought in terms of returning CO2 back to the atmosphere. Thank you.
Our lightning talk speakers. Where are my lightning talk? Yes, I see Ileana, Emily, and Helene. Helene, you were first up. Are you ready?
Perfect. Yeah. It's a pleasure to present today our approach in quantifying how nutrient and carbon inputs from land affect acidification, specifically in the Arctic Ocean. So, well, on a global scale, and you can advance one slide. Thank you. Ocean acidification is mainly driven by increasing CO2 emissions in the Arctic. We sort of have a special case where ocean acidification is additionally influenced by pretty large amounts of carbon and nutrients entering from land. And the main two pathways through which these terrigenous inputs are entering are coastal erosion and rivers. And what it has been shown in many, especially observational studies, that these inputs are quite important for not only acidification, but a lot of biogeochemical parameters in the Arctic. These inputs are still quite poorly represented in models, and in many cases omitted altogether, leaving a knowledge gap in understanding their impact, especially on a pan-Arctic scale, which is why we try to quantitatively answer the questions: how do terrigenous inputs affect acidification in the Arctic? And to answer this question, we used an ocean model, specifically NEMO-PSGIS, and with that model performed 3 different simulations. So first of all, a baseline scenario, which basically includes all terrigenous inputs from all sources, and then 2 sensitivity experiments, which enabled us to quantify the different effects of the different sources of terrigenous inputs on Arctic Ocean biogeochemistry. Right. Perfect. And what we specifically looked at is the aragonite saturation state omega, which describes the thermodynamic stability of calcium carbonate minerals and thus directly relates to the stability of their structures, including shells and skeletons. And so what we found in that box 5 here, you can see the baseline distribution in subpanel A of omega aragonite, where you can basically see that the Arctic is already undersaturated with respect to aragonite in several regions of the Arctic, right, especially close to the coast. However, more interestingly, here in this study, C to E, subpanel C to E, show the effect of terrigenous inputs, so anomalies driven by these terrigenous inputs relative to the baseline scenario in A. And what this essentially shows us is that terrigenous inputs on average help to mitigate acidification, mainly due to riverine inputs, while inputs from coastal erosion mainly add to acidification. So these are 2005 to 2010 averages, by the way. And if you can advance one slide, we see that this, what you just saw, are just the surface ocean effects. However, there is quite a pronounced vertical structure in the effect that terrigenous inputs have on acidification. So starting now with subpanel D on the right-hand side, we see that the effect of riverine inputs, this mitigating effect, is strongest at the very surface ocean and attenuates with depth, whereas the effect of coastal erosion really intensifies with depth and has the subsurface maxima between somewhere of 5 or between 5 and 50 meter depth. And this leads, taken together, to this interesting pattern where terrigenous inputs on average mitigate acidification at the surface ocean while they intensify acidification below. And this vertical pattern is even intensified during summer. On the next slide, you can see that, right? Where actually even coastal erosion inputs drive a mitigation of acidification at the very surface ocean in subpanel K. And while there are many processes at play, I tried to summarize a couple of the most important processes in a little scheme. And so this is now for coastal erosion, right? You can advance one slide. showing that we have organic carbon entering, which is remineralized, releasing CO2, actually contributing to acidification of the surface ocean. However, at the same time, coastal erosion introduces nutrients which fuel additional prime productivity, which takes up CO2 and thus mitigates acidification in the surface ocean, strong enough to even cause some CO2 ingassing. However, parts of the newly produced organic matter sinks to depth, where it's again remineralized, releasing CO2 at the subsurface ocean. Now, for riverine inputs, we basically have the very same processes at play. However, in addition, rivers deliver inorganic carbon and therefore directly add to total alkalinity and thus mitigate acidification. And so in the end, we conclude that terrigenous inputs are definitely important for model-based projections of various biogeochemical parameters in the Arctic, not only acidification, but also net prime productivity, remineralization, SeCO2 gas exchange, and so on, and are therefore definitely worthwhile to include in models.
Excellent. Thank you, Helene. Now we move on to Emily Bristol. Emily, are you here?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm currently a postdoc at USGS, but I'm here to present a bit of work I did on Arctic coastal groundwater while I was a PhD student at UT Austin. I did this work with a great team of collaborators from Florida State and Woods Hole as well. I work on the very northern coast of Alaska on the Beaufort Sea. This is Inupiat land, and I just want to mention that the subsistence lifestyle, which is based on these coastal resources, is really important for the people and the culture there. Despite that this area is covered by snow and ice for 9 months of the year, it supports these really productive coastal ecosystems, birds, whales, polar bears, etc. And as mentioned earlier today in great talks, terrestrial organic matter and nutrients are really important for Arctic ocean biogeochemical cycling and ecosystems. And there's been a good amount of work on rivers and coastal erosion, but there is limited efforts to understand groundwater inputs to the Arctic Ocean. So coastal groundwater is a little bit different in this area than to other parts of the world because there is continuous permafrost. So here we see groundwater flow is confined to these very shallow flow paths in the seasonally thawed organic rich tundra soils. And work by collaborators and others shows that this fresh groundwater that flows through these tundra soils does discharge in the Arctic Ocean. And importantly, this work has also shown that with this water, there's a lot high concentrations of DOC that contribute to high DOC fluxes to the Beaufort Sea that we estimate could be on the order of riverine inputs during the summer. But the focus of my work is to really dig into what is that chemical composition of the dissolved organic matter in the super permafrost groundwater, and is it biodegradable? So we went to the North Slope and we sampled fresh coastal groundwater and compared that with surface water samples. And we did this across 3 different seasons: the spring when ice is breaking up in the rivers and lagoon, summer, the open water season, and then again in fall when the tundra and lagoons are starting to freeze up. And I just want to emphasize how much dissolved organic matter is in groundwater on the North Slope of Alaska. We see that it is much, much more in rivers, and you can even see by looking at that photo just how dark that filtered water is from the dissolved organic matter. I used bottle incubation experiments to look at how biodegradable that organic matter was, and we see that groundwater contains much more biodegradable organic matter than river water, at least within seasons. And then in both groundwater and in river waters, we see that biodegradability declines as we go from spring to fall. So to learn more about the composition of dissolved organic matter, how it compares between groundwater and surface waters, and also how it relates to biodegradability, We use ultra-high resolution mass spectrometry, specifically FTI-CRMS of solid phase extraction DOM. Here is just one figure I want to highlight. I plotted correlations between individual DOM formula and the biodegradability from the experimental work, and plotted those correlations in Venn prevalence space. And this figure shows that, as expected, we see positive correlations between sugar-like formula and biodegradability. But more surprisingly, we also have these strong positive correlations with polyphenolic and condensed aromatic formula, which I would have expected to be recalcitrant, but I think are, leaching from these tundra soils. So just to highlight the main findings from the study, the groundwater contains high concentrations of highly biodegradable DOC. That's linked to sugar-like formula and especially highly aromatic formula, which we find in spring surface waters and in groundwater throughout the year. And so overall, we think that superpermafrost groundwater flow is an important source of DOC to the Arctic Ocean during summer. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And we have our final lightning talk speaker for this session, and also the final speaker for this session, Ileana Galdames. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Are you here?
Yes.
All right, great, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Ileana Galdames, and I'm a postdoc in the NASA postdoc program at NASA Jet Propulsion Lab in the Water and Ecosystems group. And so this lightning talk is on using Earth observations to monitor sewage plumes in the Tijuana River. And of course, this is a global issue, but our particular team from JPL and San Diego State University are just focusing on this area in Southern California. And in this next slide, I can tell you more about the Tijuana River. And so there's hundreds of millions of liters of wastewater that's being expelled into the Tijuana River estuary because of failing infrastructure in the Mexico side. And so this is leading to a lot of harmful pollutants being input into the United States sides, which has led to a lot of beach closures, and it actually has led to increased health ailments, especially respiratory illness and other stomach issues in the surrounding residents. And the San Diego Public Health has actually issued air purifiers to try to mitigate those issues. And so in this next slide, what we're doing is we're using emit imagery. So this is an instrument on the International Space Station that has hyperspectral capabilities. And so because it's on the International Space Station, the passovers are a bit variable. We focused on 2023 to 2024. And then we also looking at river discharge data, fecal indicator bacteria, as this is an important public health issue in this area. And so this is provided by the state. And so usually on a weekly basis, they'll have some measurements there. And then through some partners at UCLA, they also took some water samples and they sent it for shotgun sequencing just to see the different bacterial species that are in the water. And in this next slide, you can see kind of our first use of emit imagery in this region. And so you can see that there's the student from San Diego State University found these different features, especially at the 620 nanometer mark, comparing that to other areas outside of the sewage plume. You can see that this is a feature that is pronounced in this region of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so in my work, which is on the next slide, what I've done is expanded this to not just only one day, but actually using 6 different emit scenes and trying to correlate between the across the different wavelengths and also across the fecal indicator bacteria provided by the state. And so we can see some strong positive correlations between the 681 to 490 nanometers. And so the strong correlation between turbidity and organic matter, weaker correlations with the 490 to 600 nanometers, and then the strong negative correlation with the near infrared. And then on this next slide, I just have some findings from those sequencing samples. And so, of course, with it being sewage water, there's a lot of pathogens, which is that dark blue, this Archobacter cryophilus, which is a pathogen often found in wastewater. And then in the coastal waters, which is highlighted in the boxes, so that orange and blue are more of these marine phytoplankton blooms. And so just showing how this is really proliferating that phenomena in the coast with this input of all of this sewage water. And then I just have future work that we're working on in this next slide. And so I'd like to continue to use these hyperspectral capabilities, not only with NASA MIT, but I'm also looking at PACE imagery too, which is right there on the right side. So it's particularly looking at phytoplankton and also has hyperspectral capabilities. And then integrating other data such as beach closures, more fecal indicator bacteria, and then potential to use other multispectral imagery. And we actually have an intern coming in that's going to look at synthetic aperture radar as well. And on this next slide, I just have my contact information if anyone is interested in this work that we're doing. And I thank you all for your attention.
Thanks so much, Ileana. So we are now moving on to convening our panel with all of the speakers from this morning.
I have a question for Jennifer. Great talk, by the way. How does like extreme events like floods, droughts, those things impact the major pathways you mentioned in like temperate and tropical systems?
Yeah, so certainly it's going to have an impact on which pathways are driving the fate of DOC, and this is true downstream as well. So, photochemical degradation depends strongly on water column depth. You have the highest rates at the surface where UV wavelengths are interacting with DOM, and then as you go further down in depth, you get longer wavelengths that tend to be less reactive in producing CO2. So as you know, if you have lower water levels, particularly in high DOC systems, that just means more of the water column is being broken down by light. And then you have less DOC overall being broken down by microbes. So that shifts the pathways there. And then, during flooding conditions, that affects the amount of time that DOC spends in the headwaters before reaching a river, so you get less DOC degradation overall, and certainly you'd have a lesser impact on that fate of DOM downstream.
I have a quick question for Nicole. Oh, go ahead, Tom. Do you want to start?
No, I had sent a question to Emily. I'm not sure if she left. Or if she's there.
I'm here.
There she is.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
There
I
you
was
are.
just looking over your question, and I think
Sorry,
yes,
Shaily.
I think that the groundwater is this pathway to get, a direct transport of this more labile material to the coastal waters versus, if the groundwater goes to rivers or surface water first, then yeah, I mean, there's going to be UV radiation, maybe more bacterial activity there. It's a lot warmer in the surface waters than in the groundwater too.
But one more quick question related to the microbes. The incubation or whatever you did to sort of look at the bioavailability of that, did you try feeding that to bugs from groundwater, or where were those microbes?
So I just filtered all of my samples 0.7 micron with GFF filters, which should allow some bacteria through. So I didn't do any cross inoculations. It was just whatever bacteria was in those water samples when collected. And how I'm sure they evolve once they're in the bottles too. But
thank you.
I have a quick question for, well, maybe not quick. Actually, Nicole, I hope you'll expand on this, that I had typed into the chat and I'm not sure you had a chance to look at it. You had talked about being able to incorporate isotope systematics into your reactive transport models. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is it just a stable isotope ratios are you incorporating? Can you incorporate radiogenic isotopes as
Yes.
well? I was just wondering if you could expand on that direction.
Absolutely. And I would have loved to show some of the stable isotope work, especially for the reactive transport modeling, since I spent a lot of time doing that. But I was playing with some things that I figured maybe for OCB could be a little bit more generalized. But for stable isotopes, yes, it's well integrated. The sort of reactive transport code that I use, CrunchTope, is sort of been well adapted over the years. To sort of integrate better the isotope, sort of isotope exchange behavior, especially kinetics versus equilibrium effects and such, and even exchange with mineral surfaces as you're forming and fractionating isotopes or even organic matter and such. So that's been well integrated, and for that, you can do carbon, nitrogen, sulfur. I specialize in integrating silicon stable isotopes. Of course, calcium stable isotopes is another one that's been used. Lithium, especially for weathering, has been a big one that I've seen a lot more in the literature lately. A little bit more tricky because the lithium gets incorporated into clays a bit differently. But it's useful for us, for people who do not want to think about life that much, because silicon, as we know, does get incorporated by things like diatoms or even uptake biologically. But lithium, as well as we are aware, does not yet do that. But also metals like chromium and iron, for example, have been incorporated. Radiogenically, yes, there has been some use. Specifically, I've seen it on uraniums, radiogenic isotopes in uranium series, and strontium. But yes, this is all sort of incorporated within it. I know Kay Maher at Stanford University did a lot of this work back in the day. Jennifer Druhan at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign as well has done some of this work. So can do decay, radioactive decay very well.
Okay. I have 2 follow-up questions.
Yes.
Okay. So for your kaolinite formation, your ternary plots that you had shown, I think it was nonternite, kaolinite, and
Saponite.
saponite. So you're weathering a basalt, a mafic system. Could you tell me how long was your model predicting it would take for kaolinite to form?
Oh, yes. So essentially, this depended on the amount of aluminum that was available. So when we were playing with those sort of simulations here, I'm just showing, okay, max abundance. But yes, it was around, something like you start getting kaolinite forming at around 10,000 years, something of that nature. But the thing is, we don't really know the intrinsic rates for kaolinite very well. So this is a big unknown because we can't really get it in the lab to then put in the correct rates for that in the reactive transport model.
Well, I'd like to send you some data for a study that we did in Iceland. And so this was actually a groundwater system, freshwater deltaic system in a lake that was only about 130 years old. So it was a escop that formed. The glacial meltwater got redirected, and with size fractions and synchrotron analysis, we saw a kaolinite peak that must have formed within 100 years.
And I'm not surprised by that because a sort of other aspect of the work that I do that I've never talked about here was sort of the experimental work. And we've actually been seeing that the clays, we've done this only successfully with allophane, but the work that my PhD student has been excellent at she actually was trying to precipitate these clays at low temperatures, and what she realized was that there's a big pH buffering capacity. It's very pH sensitive. So actually, she was able to form allophane almost instantaneously just by titrating with sodium hydroxide and actually changing the pH, which is something we're trying to push out as a paper. But I am actually sort of surprised to what extent this was such a major control on clay formation. So for this, I really think that that's not as shocking in my opinion.
Okay. Well, maybe you could take the data that we've gathered, which includes stable silicon isotope work for this system. And I wonder what your model would then predict for this balance of alkalinity consumption versus release in a proglacial environment, minimally vegetated, low temperature end member. So you could think of it almost like an end member constraint on
Right.
forward weathering and secondary
Mhm.
mineral precipitation.
That would be wonderful. I would love to work with
Okay,
you on that.
great. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to our audience. Questions?
Hi everyone. Maybe I have question. Maybe more to Tom and Blake to see your thoughts. So we see this like carbon fluxes to the river from land to the river, and the carbon fluxes in the river are constantly updated as far as I know. For example, this carbon degassing from the river to the atmosphere, carbon degassing from the river plus lakes plus reservoir. And the we see like increasing trend. Before it's like below one gigatons of carbon per year. Now it's like around like 2.1 gigatons of per year based on study from Peter Raymond and Shaily Liu, his newest PNAS paper and the previous Nature paper. And then we have updated flux to the ocean. That number is changing pretty little. Previously, it's only classical work of Mayback, sort of 0.8 to 0.9 gigatons of carbon. If you adding all this up, right, DIC, PIC, DUC, PUC altogether, now the work like Blake, you also showed by like Morgan and Liu, the result is around like 1.02 gigatons of carbon per year to the ocean. And then if you consider the fluxes from land to river, we kind of have a really big range. I think the updated now is kind of like a 5 gigatons of carbon per year to the river. So if you calculate this like carbon balance, right? 5 gigatons to the river, 2 gigatons to the atmosphere, 1 gigaton to the ocean, there are still like 2 gigatons left. So people talk about maybe there are 0.9 to 1 gigatons of carbon buried during this river transport and in the lakes, but there's still like 1 gigatons of carbon kind of like missing in my mind. So I'm not sure how well we know this carbon burial specifically, because in my talk, I talk a little bit about this carbon precipitation, right? But people, if I understand correctly, people more like treating this carbon burial in the river system is organic carbon. There's not much inorganic carbon like precipitating there. I'm not quite sure how much carbonate burial in the current river system compared to the organic carbon burial. Is it a big thing in this river system? I'm sorry, it's a real like long question.
Maybe you can comment, because I think floodplains probably play a pretty big in the potential imbalance between the net fluxes. I mean, with the 2024 global carbon budget, there was a 400 teragram imbalance. And yes, the fluxes from land to sea and then outgassing have been updated as more measurements and the ability to model those fluxes has the capacity has increased. But also we have to think like the amount of CO2 that's being fixed by the terrestrial ecosystem has also increased, right? Because the CO2 in the atmosphere has increased. And so if we think back to like that, the figure I showed with the land, ocean, aquatic continuum with the loops, there's an increase in the land flux of almost 2 teragrams, right? Due to human activity. And that's, I don't know, essentially like there's going to be some sort of potential lag, or there's other processes that factor in when it comes to like weathering and DIC and alkalinity. But at least for like the organic matter, we can definitely probably correlate the increase in the flux and the concentration globally to just the increase in the amount of CO2 that's being fixed on land over time. I think that the ability to include the impacts of human and the non-human, or pre-industrial fluxes in predicting the global carbon budget is pretty key for limiting that that imbalance and decreasing uncertainty. Like if you think about the next like CMIP, right? Like a lot of uncertainty through time is related to not knowing like what the flux was before we had a bunch of measurements. So
yeah.
I don't know, Tom, if you want to comment on like floodplains and storage and changes over time.
No, I mean, this is a little more outside of some of the details that I might be or I would like to be more familiar with than I am on this particular topic. I mean, I've been working more at the coastline in recent years, but I mean, I think certainly one of the things that's changed as you move through these different budgets that's always been of concern is the overestimate of what's going into the terrestrial net primary production and not accounting for lateral export and some of the other things. There's always been arguments about that. And I know they mentioned that in the Drake paper, 2018, it was in L&O letters. And so they talk about that, and those folks are much more qualified than I am. I mean, Raymond, and I mean, I don't know if David Butman's on, or even others that work much more in that area than I do. Again, I treat it more as a much bigger blocks of information going from the mountains to the coast. So I don't think I'm really qualified to really talk about some. I think it's a really good question as you see things creeping up, but I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to speculate too much. So I not to punt on that, but I that's the only thing I can bring up. It's just that has how that's evolved in terms of thought about export from the terrestrial and translocation, the importance of translocation products as well. So that there's a lot of discussion on that. But yeah, I'm just not really the right person. There may be someone else on, as I said, if some of those folks are on. But I think it's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Tom and Blake. I do feel this uncertainty thing and this pre-industrial one. So very good point. Sorry, Jennifer.
I'll just add something, just on the DOC side. I think, with these global compilations of, estimating DOC export to the coast, a lot more numbers are coming in from the tropics that, we didn't have, 5-10 years ago. And so as those numbers come in, it's definitely impacting that total number. So one thing I did actually notice from the that latest paper from last September is the estimates from Southeast Asia actually use a watershed primarily draining peatlands. And so the number from that region in particular is actually like much higher than it should be, because once you actually balance, take into account the percent of wetland versus non-wetland soils, you get a much lower estimate. So I think things like that, as we, get a better grasp of the distribution of carbon coming from different sources in the tropics, that number is going to change. And then also just, another example from Southeast Asia, with wetland disturbance, it also has increased DOC export by about 10%. So as, more lands are being disturbed, that also will have an impact on that number.
Questions from our audience?
Yeah, I have a question on modeling part. Thank you for the talks. Like you mentioned, both like reactive transport modeling, machine learning methods. Could you talk a bit more about like the strengths, limitations of each approach? I feel like there's a big need for better estimates of river material fluxes, like alkalinity into like ocean models. I'm curious how these methods complement and can help in that area, especially like Nicole, Shuang, if you can comment on that.
Yes. So in terms of, sorry, Faye, I was responding to another question at the same time. But you were basically saying how we integrate things like process-based models with things that are now like machine learning and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a sort of like a very unique space to play within because of course, like at least from my perspective, the machine learning models are very useful and especially they allow us to start to tease apart really complex data sets. And complex like variables that are integrated in, what is a highly coupled system, which are the geochemical and biogeochemical waters that we have. So it does a good first order job. And process-based is trying to understand what are the mechanisms that are driving that observed behavior. So both sort of can work in tandem. And sometimes, trying to apply a reactive transport process-based model to a data set that is fundamentally highly coupled and hard to tease apart could be a real challenge. And this is where machine learning could actually help to simplify the data sets for us such that that is in a space that we can start to then incorporate reactive transport modeling in a way that is can be more globally applied than it currently is. So I think that's like a future for it. I'm sure maybe Shuang or others might have some more opinions on that, but I think a big challenge for us is how much complexity do we incorporate into models to explain the observed behavior, and how much do we need to really extract these first order controls? So I think that's the challenge between the two. I'll leave it to anyone else who wants to jump in.
Yeah, so Nicole, I totally agree. So I didn't talk much about machine learning, although machine learning is a middle step in my final river model. So exactly as Nicole said, it's like in tandem. So one part you use machine learning, the other part you might need to use like physical based model. So my opinion for machine learning is that if you only focus on prediction, right, within the scope of your data, for example, if you collect really abundant data over the whole US, covering different land types, lithology, hydrology, climatology, geomorphology. So all these like different features, you can theoretically build a very powerful machine learning model to use that to predict many things like alkalinity concentration in the river, alkalinity flux, calcium, magnesium, all these predicted variables, all these target like variables. Assume you have abundant like data, so you generally will have a higher prediction power, as far as I know, based on my experience, compared to physics-based model. If you have abundant data and your machine learning model is able to resolve this nonlinear relationship between your predicted variable and your target variables, as well as a correlation between your predicted variables. Now, people argue against machine learning because it's kind of a black box, right? So if you use like if you use like linear regression, yes, we can call linear regression as a machine learning. It is a basic machine learning method. It is pretty interpretable. However, if you move on to neural networks, this is, if you submit like papers, not only for prediction purpose, but also for interpretation purpose, the reviewers might argue, okay, how do you explain your relationship between your predicted variable and your target variable? That's fair, because machine learning, many machine learning algorithms, especially like a deep one, might not be able to tell you a lot about this causation. It can tell you some like correlation thing, but this like causation thing is really like tricky. It's hard to interpret why you have this like pattern. Yes, you can have different metrics like step values, different list metrics to tell you when one feature is changing or your target variable is like changing. That's true. You can also use these shape values or other feature importance metrics to tell you the correlation of different parameters in driving the change of your target variable. However, it is still lacking this physical like meaning, right? This is one thing. The other thing, more important, I think one speaker also really said, is that if your data, predicted data, is out of your scope of your current data used for machine learning, you might have big trouble. If you use random forest, very simple, it will be limited to the scope of your current data, right? You can, of course, use additional methods like QBeast. It can extrapolate random forest to the areas of you don't see these parameters, because for the tree, it will build a regression there to let you able to extrapolate from the current scope of data to out of the scope of data. However, it is still a not perfect. It's not a perfect result. Anytime you do this extrapolation, you should be really, really careful how your machine learning deal with that. So to me, if my purpose is for prediction, for example, if I want to map all this river chemistry across the whole US, if I have abundant US data available, I'm pretty comfortable. But if you want to use to tell people why your parameters are driving the real change of that, I think I should be careful on that. The other issue is that if your feature is highly correlated, as far as I know, all machine learning algorithms will suffer from the feature importance. For example, temperature precipitation, if they are highly correlated, if you use a feature importance, the feature importance can be diluted by these two correlated features. Unless you delete one of that, maybe your temperature can be pretty important than other parameters. So there are many issues there, but in practical use case, it's still powerful for the prediction. It's my two things here.
Great, thank you so much. It's very helpful.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat from Lisa Marie Windemeyers. Love these talks. In wondering if non-stationarity in hydroclimate or other aspects are a particular source of uncertainty you've been addressing. And this is for the whole group, also for Blake. Supercomputing approach.
For like specific regional models that I run, we use like the observed river discharge and reanalyzed weather. So the non-stationarity in the forcing for the models is built in. However, the response of the biogeochemical cycling is not, right? Where we could potentially like in terms of the amount or the rate at which organic matter would be degraded in the ocean over time would also be changing. It's not included within the model. And so I think that is an area where we can use more advanced approaches that Nicole or Emily probably can be really great at informing in terms of how we include the non-stationarity of reactivity into models which would typically use like just a constant rate for the degradation or transport or not transport or weathering of the minerals from land.
Any other follow-up answers to this question?
I'm just going to assume that with the non-stationarity in the hydroclimate, I think Blake did a great job at answering it. I just would follow up that when I hear this, I think sometimes like the rise of flooding events and these major storm events and how those are captured in models, and those are extremely hard sort of aspects to take into account. First, because just to sort of put some context into it, the data sets alone, now we're starting to get more and more well-instrumented rivers that are getting that geochemical and that high resolution data that would be needed to sort of evaluate the impacts of non-stationarity and basically these big flood events that are having disproportionate effects on solute fluxes. But we're still not at 100% to be able to like actually look at this in a big space. I know there's a big effort to sort of start to get that data and have more high resolution 15-minute interval or sort of river lab sites that some of my French colleagues have been trying to set up. That would be an avenue to sort of start looking at this. But right now we're at a sort of data gap in terms of we still have very low coarse resolution data sets that are sort of not capturing. Sometimes you capture, sometimes you don't, but sort of are masking some of these effects that probably do have a very large importance into basically observed river biogeochemical fluxes.
Would you say that, we've had a couple of questions here about stochastic events. Would you say that this coarse resolution and this data gap is a major one, given how, for example, flood events could deliver a year's worth of sediment to an estuary in one day.
Yes, I think it's quite a big oversight that we have, and even in you think of these snowmelt dominated catchments and watersheds where you think of seasonal variation just being good enough, but these are starting to transition into more rain domains, and so these events are starting to have more and more of an impact. So. And even in those snowmelt catchments where you would think maybe a resolution of biweekly or such is good enough, we have recently campaigned for did a campaign of a snowmelt season at almost a daily resolution, and you see that there's quite a lot of variability there that is quite important into the observed solufluxes that we're not capturing. So I would say that yes, these events are because of climate change are becoming more impactful and probably need to be looked at, especially on the timeframes that we're interested in when we're considering, human timescales or net zero initiatives, and also what are the impacts of climate change on watersheds and all different sorts of effects.
Right. Well, I think that in addition to high resolution sampling, I think we're missing quite a lot of data from the entire continent of Africa. For example, like big geographic gaps, almost no data points from there. And with that, unfortunately, I do have to wrap up our session and our panel discussion. And thank you to all the speakers for this first sub-session of our larger session. Thanks so much.